Well, we're going to continue since I've got about an hour and a half here to it's midnight. I wanted to continue to read the particular book I'm reading, The Rape of Justice by Eustace Mullins, chapter 8, that is, as we continue to go through this particular book. This is a lot of information that Mr. Eustace Mullins reported and gave. Um, if you can get this book, it's well worth it. I think that one of the things that's critical is for this is a reference to what has been happening to our country ever since Woodrow Wilson's been involved. That is, he started this all, although it goes back further than that. But with him, his progressives, that is, it has almost been enormously them been in power, stealthily moving slowly but gently, not gently but slowly, taking over in all areas of our lives and destroying this country in all ways. We're just seeing the financial part right now, but it's incredibly how justice is and how there aren't many good people left in office anywhere, no matter what political party you're talking about. And they're now the minority. And the best thing I can suggest, I'm just being straightforward. The best thing to do is not to vote. They're not worthy of votes. Maybe they'll get the fucking message that they're not worthy of being in office, period, by everybody. That's what you should do. That's the only way. That's the only way I know how to solve this problem, because there aren't any good people running for office, folks. I don't care. Even at local positions, you can see this happening. So, but anyway, I don't want to go on a diatribe. Anyway, we're going to continue this particular book here, and let's get into it. And thank you for being here. And this particular chapter is chapter 8, called Durant's Vile, V-I-L-E. Thank you for being here. This is for people who have ears to hear and people who have eyes to see. Our present custom of confining criminals in expensive prisons is a costly relic of humanist thought. It can be traced back to the Renaissance period in Italy. In the classical world of Greece and Rome, society protected itself by killing or exiling criminals or persons who presented a clear and present danger to society. The purpose was to remove a threat to the common weal. With the rebirth of humanist influences on society, a phoenix-like revival of a cult which has been feared and hated by society since the bloodthirsty riots of Baal and Ashtoreth some 5,000 years earlier. See The Curse of Canaan by Eustace Mullins. Came the compassion pretext of preserving and coddling the criminal element. The thought of maintaining such a threat in perpetual would have been seemed the height of insanity to classical thinkers. We've evolved the cultural basis of our civilization. During the Middle Ages, wielders of power built huge castles, fortresses, where they could defend themselves against their enemies. Deep within the bowels of these castles, dungeons were built for the incarcerations of enemies whose sudden death might have unleashed dangerous forces. Clamors to power or religious martyrs who, for various reasons, might be allowed to live for many years, but whose imprisonment itself constituted a living death. With the growing infiltration of the black nobility into the European monarchy, the aristocrats were persuaded that the imprisonment of criminals could serve as a deterrent and warning to others who posed a threat to society. The most famous prisons resulting from the concept were the Tower of London and the Bastille in Paris. The Tower of London became the home of many prominent political offenders, including Sir Edward Coke, C-O-K-E. In France, the Bastille, I should say, held a curious mix of hardened criminals and political offenders. The liberation of total of 7 prisoners in the Bastille on July 14, 1789, which is now the French national holiday corresponding to our 4th of July, resulted in the freeing of 4 professional forgers, 1 libertine who had been imprisoned as the insistence of his exasperated family, and 2 lunatics. One of the lunatics was then carried through the streets by a cheering crowd. He believed that he was Julius Caesar and that Rome had once again become the center of the world. The only casualty of liberation was the warden. who was dragged out into the street and torn to pieces by the mob. 4 days earlier, the warden had insisted upon the release of the Bastille's most famous prisoner, Marquis de Sade, who had continually floated notes from the window to the secret street below, demanding that he be freed. Bastille Day not only celebrates the triumph of lunacy and sadism, but also the triumph of the Masonic conspiracy over the French monarchy. Some 60 years earlier, the rise of the House of Hanover in London had installed Freemasonry in England under the royal patronage. Early 19th century reformers such as Jeremy Bentham, the prodigy of the, sorry, I started this over. Jeremy Bentham, Bentham, the prodigy of the East India Company, and William Godwin, whose daughter wrote Frankenstein, invented the intellectual foundation of a fantasy structure which was called a correctional system. The term prison was deemed too calculating. Too calumniating. Henceforth, prisoners would be known as victims of society. Who must be corrected and imbued with correct social attributes. Instead of society being protected from criminals, it was now the criminals who were to be cassé and cared for while they prepared for the day of their revenge upon society. The heirs to the cult of Baal, the humanists, claimed that bad environment creates the criminal class. The removal of the criminal from this unfortunate situation to a prison where he could be cared for would correct his criminal tendencies. The humanists then developed a new social science, penology, which, like all the misconceptions sprawled by the new wave, psychology, civics, and social welfare, gradually merged to form a huge modern combine or trust nurtured by the tax-exempt humanist foundations. Penology began with praiseworthy effects of a few conscientious persons to alleviate the harsh conditions of prisoners in the early 1800s. Remember that life was harsh for most Americans at that time, and it was unlikely that the prisons would be maintained with better living conditions than those enjoyed by the average pioneer. Conditions were slowly improved, but by the turn of the century, prisons had become part of the overall bureaucracy, which meant that they were part of the spoil system, the graft, and the political influence. Like insane asylums and other government institutions, prisons were turned into gold mines of graft for those fortunate enough to wield political power, most of their funds appropriated for the feeding and carrying of prisoners being pocketed by those who had mastered the democratic process. Faced with the difficulty of influencing the bureaucracy, the humanists began to develop new methodology in their campaign for prison reform. Their first discovery was that no human being should ever be incarcerated. This was hardly a revolutionary thought. It had been the precept of founders of classical civilization. The humanists began to implement their goal of emptying the prisons by formulas for work release, early parole, and family furloughs for prisoners. The problem was that these techniques resulted in a dramatic increase in crime and caused the prisons to become more overcrowded than ever. The humanists also developed programs of intensive psychotherapy for those prisoners who were not yet eligible for the release program. The released prisoners, most of whom were recidivicists or habitual criminal psychopaths, committed horrendous crimes which caused public outrage and to demand that more millions be spent for police protection and for the building of more prisons. Faced with the process of vast increases in their funding, the bureaucrats of the crime industry realized that the humanistic procedure were indeed evidence of gratifying results of the new science of penology. Burdened with the task of spending more millions than they had ever envisioned, the prison bureaucracies became enthusiastic converts to the obvious advantages of social activist penology. The science of penology came into its own after World War II when a horde of rapious humanists who had been indoctrinated by the professional social sciences of Tavistock Institute and its numerous American satellites obtained lucrative employment throughout the prison system. The Tavistock Institute had been set up after the First World War as a branch of the British Army Department of Psychological Warfare to study the methods of controlling shell-shocked soldiers. Their purpose was to use these unfortunate victims of war as guinea pigs, testing them to see how much strain was necessary before the average human would break under stress. The technique of communist brainwashing was one of the most successful offshoots of the studies. It sprawled a host of refinements such as motivational technology and stress management, which educated and government leaders and business executives are now required to undergo as one of Tavistot's Institute spinoffs throughout the United States. The purpose of these brainwashing techniques is to trick the subject into admitting some sexual misconduct, a hidden fear, or other weakness, exposing Achilles' heel by which he can then be manipulated for the rest of his career. The goal is people control. It originated in the Jesuitical techniques of the Inquisition during the Middle Ages. Sorry, I can't get that word out. Inquisition, to say, and is now the basis for the entire operation of the United States government, especially those departments engaged in intelligence work, such as the CIA, the IRS, and other conspiratorial areas. The purpose of the Jesuitical confession is always control. For this reason, the American judicial system insists not only upon confession, but upon conviction, expression of remorse. Many Americans who have been convicted of some political offenses in our courts self-righteously refuse to express remorse, which justifies the gleeful judge in giving them a much harder sentence than he could have pronounced if they had groveled and sprouted emotional recrimination. This was graphically demonstrated at the end of the political show trials called the Watergate trials. Republican political offenders were sentenced to long terms by the Democratic-controlled court, the longest sentence being handed down to Nixon's former aide, G. Gordon Liddy, L-I-D-D-Y, because he refused to recant. This religious error resulted in his spending many years in prison, which he might have avoided by the required cringing and apostasy. Even so, the process was more humane than that of the Middle Ages, where the prisoner was tortured until he recanted and was then burned. The purpose of our criminal justice system is not to remove the criminal from society, but to find the lever by which he can be manipulated by the conspirators. His handler does not care whether it is sex, drugs, a irrational fear, or whatever weakness. The goal of the Tavistock method is to find that lever. Another key point is manipulating the subject to convince him that everything that is being done to him is being done for his own good. He cannot make any progress until he relieves his mind through the techniques of confessions. The appalling cynicalism of these manipulators is beyond most moral individuals' capacity of understanding. They cannot comprehend the satanic origins of these techniques unless they are familiar with the 5,000-year-old cult of Baal and the worldwide Canaanite conspiracy. Even after conviction and sentencing, the prisoner is still expected to offer continuous acts of contrition, which will result in an early release through parole or furlough. The result is that many prisoners find Christ the moment the prison's doors clang shut behind them, most notorious being one of the Watergate victims, that is Charles Colson, who was so successful in charming his way out of prison that he opted for prison religious work rather than returning to his lucrative law practice. Although the prison parole system remains firmly grounded in bribery and political influence, the members of the parole board still place great stock in Jesuits' expression of contrition from those who seek release. Such expression also offers a convenient screen for the hidden reasons behind the sudden parole of notorious criminals. Because penology is based upon humanism, the modern version of the cult of Baal, prisoners who have been accused of anti-humanistic activities such as religion, belief, patriotism, or belief in the Constitution are never granted parole. They always serve out their entire sentences. Such offenders, including those Americans suspected of anti-communism, tax resistors, who are often referred to by the servile media as tax protesters. It has never been a crime to the United States to protest any tax imposition. And members of the white ethnical minority who have been indicted for racism. In our legal terminology, a racist is anyone who publicly refers to white racial ethnicities. It's obligatory for blacks, Jews, and Hispanics to constantly parade their racial loyalties and to beat or kill anyone who criticizes them. Actions which find instant approval in the media and our courts. Should one of these activists accuse a white citizen of racism, the white citizen is promptly arrested and convicted. The Department of Justice has publicized for years this policy that only whites can be charged and convicted of crimes of racism. The President writer has letters from high-ranking officers of the Department of Justice that the white citizen of the United States has no civil rights and cannot claim any redress for violation of civil rights. The Department of Justice apparently bases its stance upon the 14th Amendment that special rights and privileges were conferred upon blacks and other minorities, while apparently stripping white citizens of these same rights and privileges. The Oxford English Dictionary defines privilege as the grant of a right and also a grant of immunity, which the Department of Justice interprets as being conferred upon racial minorities by the 14th Amendment passed under martial law. It was passed under martial law. Therefore, it was invalid. Correct. It was invalid, but which is denied members of white ethnic groups in this nation. Yes. In fact, we're still under martial law, folks. We never have come out of martial law. Truly. I'm serious. During the 1950s, the already outmoded or outmodeled and discredited 19th century humanistic claims of penology were expanded to increasingly vaporous and unrealistic programs. Prison guards were forced to endure extensive human rights and sensitivity sessions by the Tavistots, manipulated as part of the nationwide brainwash dictate, D-I-K-T-A-T. Guards were told that they must address prisoners as sir, they must never raise their voices to them, no matter what the provocation, and that must deliver prison printed menus to the cell before the prisoners were marched to the mess hall. A new California prison has developed an even more costly program in which meals are delivered by hot carts to each cell. State dominated by the more humanistic conspiracy, notably in Massachusetts and Maryland, eagerly adopted the most extreme advances of the new penology. The Massachusetts program was so exhausted that it caused a taxpayer revolt. It also cost its governor, Michael Dukakis, the 1988 presidential election. A notorious murderer, Willie Horton, had been released on one of its numerous furlough programs of the new penology. He promptly killed again. The liberal colleges of Massachusetts had previously indoctrinated a horror of practitioners of humanistic penology, the most notorious being Dr. Norman Gluckstern, Gluckstern, a leading radical at the University of Massachusetts during the 1960s. Gluckstern initiated a program at the university which gave students academic credit for spending time in jail cells with extremely dangerous prisoners. The University of Massachusetts also promoted one of the most pernicious doctrines of Maoist communism, that professors and business leaders should spend 6 months of each year in working at some form of manual labor. It was hardly surprising that Dr. Gluckstern would be appointed head of the nation's most troublesome prison, notorious Patuxent, P-A-T-U-X-E-N-T Institute in Maryland. Patuxent, and originally after some Maryland politicians went on a pay junkie to Denmark. After the obligatory visits to brothels and pornography shops, the politicians realized they had to justify their pleasure vacations at the taxpayers' expense. They decided to study some innovative prison techniques in a new institution outside of Copenhagen, which treated dangerous offenders by psychiatric techniques. The politicians were immediately convinced that the program offered them considerable political benefits in a caring and compassionate nation. They returned to Maryland as converts of the new wave of prison treatment. The result was that in 1955, the state of Maryland established what has now become the nation's most criticized and talked about prison, Salem A. Sarh, S-A-R-H, a scholar at the National Institute of Mental Health, who has studied the relationship of law and psychiatry for 30 years, notes that it was the heyday of the mental health movement, you see. The feeling was that to just lock people up was not effective. You had to treat them. The treatment consisted of interviews of prisoners by well-paid mental health experts who asked them, do you think you are dangerous? Do you think you would ever rape again? These interviews allowed these prisoners who were professional criminals to play the favorite indoor sport of our prisons, smoozing or conning the liberals. The prisoners immediately embraced the Tavistock and Jesuit techniques of confessing what the interviewer wanted to hear. I'm in jail because I couldn't control my greed, because of my insensitivities, of my self-destructive tendencies. The only person I love, I'm sorry, the only person I have ever really harmed is myself. Such stroking convinced the penologist that the criminal had experienced a genuine reform. He was now a model prisoner who was ready to be returned to society. One of those prisoners who was then thus returned to society was Robert Angell, Angell, who had murdered two policemen in cold blood during the commissions of other crimes. It was disclosed in November of 1988 that this triple murderer had left Panama 11 times on unsupervised furloughs. He had killed a teenager in 1975, choosing him at random, and then murdering him and killed two policemen in Potomac a year later during a bank robbery. Dr. Glustern justified her decision to release Angel by her conviction that Angel was a completely different person who deeply regrets murdering three people. The Glustern program of sending the most dangerous criminals from Puntizin inaugurated a reign of terror and fear among residents in the area. Some people sold their homes and moved away, certain that they would never be safe while penitentiary remained a fertile breeding ground for crime. One prisoner, while on an unsupervised furlough, raped and killed an 11-year-old boy. Another prisoner, Charles Wanland, Wantland, was paroled after serving 5 years of a 30-year sentence. He raped and killed a 12-year-old boy in Clinton, Maryland. A few weeks later, convicted rapist James Stark Bareski, whose early parole had been revoked, fled while on work release from Panama's and allegedly raped another woman. Panama's records proved that its inmates served substantially shorter sentences for violent crimes from inmates at other Maryland institutions. Fernando F. Stewart was paroled by Panama in 1981, 7 years after he had been convicted of a murder of a county police officer and sentenced to life in prison. When questioned about Stewart's release, Dr. Glustern replied, "People can change." The Glustern program of daily work release, unsupervised furloughs, and early parole was compounded by intensive psychotherapy and peer counseling sessions. These programs were made to order for hardened criminals, many of whom had spent years in their cell bonding up on psychological studies and psychiatric treatises on the criminal mind. They eagerly embraced the Jesuitical techniques of confession and recrimination as the golden keys which would unlock the doors of the prison. Because the Glustern method was tailor-made for the most ruthless class of criminals, the murderers and the rapists, its benefits were never offered to the political prisoners, the protesters, and constitutionalists who were forced to serve out their entire sentences. The Panama's board was composed of Dr. Glustern, other Pentagon administrators, and law professors. Coming under fire from her policies, Dr. Glustern protested, "This place has a mission, whether you believe in the mission or not. I sort of was the caretaker of a historical institution, and when you see it being wiped out, there's a certain sadness." She was referring to the rising tide of public outrage at her methods of managing Perpetuous Institute. She was referring to the rising tide of public outrage in her methods of managing Perpetuous Institute. Russell A. Hammett, vice chairman of the Montgomery Criminal Justice Commission, said public safety is too important to be left to psychiatry. He described Perpetuous as nothing but a psychiatric sandbox. State Senate President Mike Minow Jr. said Dr. Glustern was a disaster, refusing to express any concern for the victims of her pampered inmates. Dr. Glustern vanished from the scene. The Washington Post later found her in literal encampment of Telluride, Colorado, operating a bed and breakfast inn. After the unsupervised furlough and work release programs at Panama were ended in December 1988, Gerald A. Vaughn, former director of the International Association of Police Chiefs, wrote an op-ed piece for the Washington Post December 13, 1988, in which he pointed out the Willis, Horton, and Robert Anderson cases are not all that unique. Last year alone, more than 200,000 weekend or multi-day furloughs were granted to prisoners in our federal and state institutions. About 0.5% committed a violent act while on furlough. Nearly 1,000 violent crimes each year. prisoners only serve 45% of their total sentences, you see, on average. Prison furloughs in their current form undermine the integrity of our criminal justice system and make a mockery of meaningful sanctions against criminal behavior. Government does have a moral obligation to protect the public from criminal adjudicated guilty of heinous crimes. Increasing public apprehension about criminals walking the streets after being sent to prison was reflected in the presidential campaign of 1988, in which George Bush, a pleasant but uninspiring candidate, found a long uphill struggle to overcome the vast lead amassed by Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis. Dukakis had the media, the entire academic community, the bureaucracy, the unions, and the minorities allied in the rebirth of the old Roosevelt coalition, which had been put together by communist leader Bela Montkoski, I should say, in 1932. This flagrance of political power seemed destined to crush the Bush appeal. A Bush advisor, Lee Atwater, finally became aware of the most widespread emotion in America, fear. He advised the public of the Massachusetts penology machine, which had unleashed a horror of vicious criminals on the nation, the most notorious being one of Willie Horton. The people responded by marching to the polls and voting against the criminal psychology program of Dukakis and his Massachusetts left-wing demagogues. Nevertheless, penology continues to be a growth industry in the United States, with a number of private firms entering the field. That's correct. There's almost all of it now is corporations. It's not even, in fact, it's not even government already run. It's government money, but it's no longer run by, which is it's very scary. It's they're no longer under supervision of the government, that is, because they're not responsible to the government, you see. The Correctional Corporation of America is the industry leader. Its directors interlock with gambling interests and the Brofman liquor empire. Wow. RCA, I want to say RCA, operates the Weaverville Prison Union. I don't know what this RCA, it must be something to do with something. It's not, the Correctional Corporation of America is not RCA. Let's see here. Anyway, it operates the Weaverville Prison Unit in Pennsylvania. The Eckerd Foundation operates the Okeechobee Prison in Florida. The prison bureaucracy has also developed its own version of the Soviet slave labor camps called Unicor, UNICOR. It produces 192 different products in our federal prisons, paying the inmates an average of 60 cents an hour. Unicor states that it is a government corporation wholly owned, despite the fact that on December 6, 1945, Congress passed 31 USCA 866, no corporation shall be created, organized, or acquired by the federal government. No wholly owned government corporation shall continue after June 30th, 1948. The private corporate authority of every such corporation shall take the necessary steps to institute dissolution of liquidation proceedings before that date. Unicor bureaucracy are now demanding that the government double its prison capacity to fulfill its burgeoning slave labor contracts. You see, the federal government is now kidnapping many people and holding them for years in prison. Unicor has also many contracts with government departments. At the Lexington Federal Prison, HUD, HUD, Department of Housing and Development, contracted with federal prison industry, Unicor, to process some 60,000 credit applications for mortgages. What? Prisons operate 35 computer terminals processing forms containing credit card numbers and other vital bank and credit information for the 60,000 applicants. One prisoner, Beverly Hirsch, was horrified to find that such personal information was being made available to prisoners who could pass the members along to accomplices outside the prison. She talked to a reporter from Lexington Herald Leader. The result was that she was immediately placed in solitary confinement. Are you kidding me? Wow, her security status was changed to a derogative one, and she was soon transferred to California, far from her children and her recent widowed mother. Prisoners who run afoul to penology bureaucracy receive the full treatment, loss of rights, that is called diesel therapy, that is repeated transfer further and further away from their loved ones, often with months passing in which relatives do not know where they are. and lost their rights while in transit. The U.S. Marshal Service uses more than 800 county jails as stopovers for the victims of diesel therapy. As a snitch on prison corruption, Beverly Hirsch will remain in transit for many months. God. Another well-known prisoner, Rudy Stankov, has also been the victim of diesel therapy for blowing the whistle on Unicor's slave labor prison practices in our federal prisons. Stankov has been the victim of diesel therapy 18 times, sometimes being moved from one prison to another 3 or 4 times in a period of 2 or 3 weeks. In less than 2 years of his imprisonment, he had been in solitary confinement 472 days. The story of this criminal illustrates the depth to which our criminal justice system has sunk. Stankov was one of the fastest growing meat packers in the United States. A rival meat packing group tried to force him out of business. When that failed, they offered to buy him out. He refused. He was then subject to public pillage by several national televised programs where ex-employees who had been bribed by his competitors claimed he had sold spoiled meat to school luncheon programs. He was then indicted and convicted on perjury testimony. His rivals took over his plant for 10 cents on the dollar. Stankov wrote a book about his experience called The Score, for which the present writer wrote forward. He identified his persecutors as a Zionist cartel, which enraged the manipulators of the secret government. Stankov was sentenced to a long prison term. There would be no psychotherapy counseling for him. His captors were told to give him the full treatment, continuously diesel therapy, solitary confinement, and brutal mistreatment, which after some months had caused the deaths of many political prisoners. Never having committed any crime, Stankov is at a great disadvantage in our prison system, which is run by and for criminals. To this day, not 1 ounce of tainted meat has ever been identified with his meat packing operation. It was a classic example of bribed witnesses, professional perjuries, and dedicated opposition to attaining their goal. The federal prison industries is listed at 320 First Street, HOLCBG, Washington, D.C. 20534. In the Reader's Guide, prison labor is listed under convict labor. Unicorn, as well as the privatization of correction industries, is but one of numerous spinoffs from our crime problem. We've had enormous growth in police forces as well as other parts of the bureaucracy. However, the greatest single beneficiary of the growing crime problem is the insurance industry. It has long been a truism that the insurance industry is almost totally dependent upon a consistent high rate of crime. Otherwise, burglary, liability, and other profitable insurance lines would shrivel up. The media cooperates by dramatizing the daily perils of life in the United States, particularly in our larger cities. On February 16, 1989, the Atlanta Journal headlined Metro Crime up 14% in 88. Doubling 87th increase. Law enforcement officers blame most of it on escalating drug use and prisoner release too soon. On January 27, 1989, the Washington Post headlined a letter from a frightening metropolis. Violent crime wave rattles even hardened New Yorkers. Fear stalks subways. The story noted that there were 1,840 homicides in New York City in 1988. A figure greater than that in most major countries of the world. Fear stalks the city so routinely that reporters are hard put to find more cliches to describe the situation. The Daily News headlined "A City Under Siege." 3 Long Island women, all of whom have obtained protective court orders, were shot and killed in a 9-day period by their estranged husbands, who then committed suicide. The women were actually killed by government psychiatrists, who, under their new designation of sociological cure, had routinely diagnosed homicidal lunatics as presenting no further threat to society, even though these men had declared their intentions of murdering their wives as soon as they were released. God, we got some mixed up people here, folks. We really do. The sick are ruling the whole country. The story continues. A pregnant doctor was raped and killed at the Bellevue Hospital, and police arrested and charged vagrants secretly living on the 22nd floor. Massive publicity focused on the trial of Joel Steinberg, the Greenwich Village lawyer accused in the beating death of his legal adopted daughter. 2 other small children died in the custody of parents whose cases were botched by the city welfare agencies. More than 50 women have been murdered in recent years after their criminally insane husbands were treated and diagnosed as cured by government staff psychiatrists. Hundreds of children have been killed after welfare agencies and supporting well-trained social workers demanded that judges order them return to brutal family situations where they were beaten and tortured until they died. Why is these people not in jail? Why don't you take some responsibility here, folks? You see, the women who notified authorities that their husband intended to kill them were also routinely judged by social workers and psychiatrists to be, these are mixed up people. They've been brainwashed, for Christ's sake. To be suffering from delusions, and most seriously of all, they were guilty of paranoia. Paranoia is one of the most serious charges a psychiatrist can make against you. It means that you suspect someone may try to harm you, and obviously delusion in this perfect world. This isn't a perfect world neither. In the New York Times Magazine, March 1989, W.H. Walsh, editor of Psychology Today, offers an authoritarian definition of paranoia as an elaborate and rigid system of delusional beliefs, complicated by elaborate and rigid belief systems. He states that a paranoia trait characterized such populist politicians as Huey Long with their grand conspiracy theories. He informs us that a paranoia person has a rigid and judgmental thought process. It is a favorite word of liberal psychoanalysis. It means that they must find a client who will hold still while they pick his pocket. He also tells us that the paranoia person characteristically exhibit grandiose and hostility, and that paranoia delusions originate in one's self-dislike. Since Max Eitingon, the colleague of Sigmund Freud, introduced psychiatry as a key element in the world communism's conspiracy, those who oppose communism have always been diagnosed as suffering from delusions and paranoia. The greatest paranoia personality of all time, of course, was Adolf Hitler, who nearly toppled the communist empire, proving that Eitingon and his fellow KGB agents were correct in fearing the paranoia enemy. The United States, any citizen who reports to the communist activities of government employees finds himself facing a quick ride to the insane asylum. When a Senator State Department official, Felix Bloch, B-L-O-C-H, was recently photographed handing over a briefcase to a KGB agent, only a paranoia suffering from anti-communist delusion would claim that he was doing anything more dangerous than exchanging family pictures of a vacation on the beach. We mention paranoia in such detail because of the psychiatric insistence that it always is delusional, and that it originates in self-hatred, a mental problem which exists only in the world of psychiatry. They all create this stuff, folks. You see, the 50 women who were slain by their lunatic husbands after reporting boasts that they intended to do just that were one and all dismissed by psychiatric experts as suffering paranoia. Apparently, it is a fatal illness because they died of it. The crime problem forced American citizens to live in a constant state of warfare, which is what they want. The Washington Post headline, February 29, 1989, that fear leads EC cab drivers to defy law. Mayor Barry, scandal-ridden District of Columbia government had passed a law fining any cab driver $100 if he passed by or refused a dangerous fare. For dangerous, it meant him black. The fact that DC cab drivers now number 97% black and that they know what they are doing when they refuse a fare did not prevent the Barry regime from labeling them as criminals. Well, these are crazy. The communists are claiming, this is amazing. I'll just continue. On January 18, 1989, the murder of a 73-year-old cab driver is one of the city's most crime-ridden areas at 3rd and Underwood Northwest in the shadow of the nation's Capitol building, forced the drivers to become more choosy in accepting their fares. In recent months, worldwide TV news coverage, particularly in Europe, which sends many tourists to Washington, has caused the city to win the title crime capital of the world. No other city comes close to Washington's capture of the label. The murder capital of the United States, with 372 murders in 1988 and 120 more in the first 3 months of 1989. Yes, Mayor Barry moved quickly to staunch the flow of blood. He announced 25 police would be detailed to arrest jaywalkers, and an estimated 10,000 jaywalking tickets would be issued by the Alert Berry police force this year. Meanwhile, Senator Mark Hatfield witnessed a shootout in the street near his office, but didn't bother to report it. He says it's so commonplace that there is no point in filling out any police report, which will promptly be buried. Berry will do nothing about the city's murder rampage, but jaywalkers have been placed on notice. Because of academia inability to see cause and result, Mullins has analyzed the capture of the title crime capital of the world. As the inevitable result of previous crime, the illegal decision of the Supreme Court in Shelby versus Kramer in 1948, because the decision was arrived at through the efforts of Justice Frankfurter Law Court as amicus curiae, and his close connections with the organization which had brought the suit, the American Jewish Congress and the American Jewish Committee. The decision must be stricken from the record as invalid. The court ruling which brought about the white flight from Washington and resulting crime wave must be corrected. Although the Federal Prison Bureau has a good thing going with its convict slave labor program, there is no congruent resultant reduction in the crime wave. Time noted May 12, 1986, that the going rate for prisoner work in New York State prison was from 32 cents to 65 cents an hour. The paperwork for the Department of Motor Vehicles was being handled by the women's prison, the Bayview Correctional Facility. Time noted August 29, 1988, that an inmate in California Lompoc, L-O-M-P-O-C prison had authored an article for the San Francisco Chronicle, The Gulag Mentality, which exposed these slave labor operations. Indignant prison officers immediately ordered a dose of diesel therapy for him. Martin was shipped to San Diego, then to Phoenix. He was sued for restraint of freedom of speech, but the judge refused to lift the order of transfer, knowing that it was for the good of the correctional system. A recent study by the RAND Corporation, R-A-N-D, shows that each criminal costs society. You want to sit down for this, folks? You really need to sit down to hear this. Costs society $430,000 a year in loot. It costs $25,000 a year to keep him in prison, indicating that society saves $405,000 a year for each criminal kept in prison. It now costs $16 billion a year for the states to house inmates. About $1 billion per year goes for their health care. AIDS is presenting a new and even more expensive medical dilemma for prison authorities, as has a rapidly aging prison population. In 1987, there were 40,000 federal prisoners, a total of 533,000 prisoners held in all U.S. prison facilities. There are constant calls for building of thousands of additional cells. Construction cost for federal prison runs from $50,000 to $100,000 per cell, depending on how many congressional relatives are connected or contracted for the job. Offenders average 187 crimes each on one every couple of days, although some energetic offenders exceed this number. To fulfill the demands of correctional officers would cost $130 billion in new prison construction, with annual budgets for prison operations rocketing from $36 billion to $60 billion per year. Although this is a reasonable figure as compared to $249 billion a year we spent for defense without defending anything, it would probably result in the United States becoming even more of a police state than it is at present, with a real crackdown wielded not against criminals but against politician distances. The direction in which government officials are likely to move was graphically demonstrated in the strange case of Congressman George Hansen. Hansen had violated the secret code of Washington that no one interfered in Middle East politics without the permission of Henry Kissinger. Hansen tried to have some American hostages freed and promptly became the only congressman ever tried under the new ethics law, which required congressmen to report their financial dealings. He incurred $1 million in legal fees, lost his home and all his possessions, and was locked up for 6 months in Petersburg, Virginia, which is considered the most brutal of the federal prisons. In contrast, Speaker of the House Jim Wright, accused of 116 ethic violations, which was later shaved to 69, allowed to depart Salem on the Potomac, which not even a wrist slap. After serving his sentence, Hansen was then arrested for speeding at a religious gathering in Omaha and flown back to Washington with his hands crudely handcuffed behind his back. He was then held under a false name so that persons interested in his fate could not locate him. The Washington Post Riley commented June 6, 1987, if you believe the Justice Department, American streets are safer than these days because George Hansen is back in prison. Post pointed out that Hansen was punished well in excess of his offense. In fact, he has never committed any offense, excepting his unauthorized flight to Tehran, Iran. His brutal treatment was protested by 239 congressmen and petitioned to President Ronald Reagan by 300,000 telephone and telegram pleas on his behalf. All were tossed in the wastebasket by the arrogant Kissinger-controlled Reagan officials. The dedication of the Department of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the Federal Bureau of Prisons to strictly political law enforcement makes it inevitable that these agencies must and will be disbanded. The sooner, the better. We cannot suffer the Department of Justice to continue as a private operation of the fanatic Zionist agents. That's good. We cannot allow the FBI to continue to serve the perverts in power as a private political police. And we cannot allow the crime wave to continue unabated while the Federal Bureau of Prisons serve as a convenient place to stash critics of our criminals in government. So that is the conclusion of Chapter 8 tonight. And I thank you for being here. Hope that you have eyes to see and ears to hear as I share this truth to others. And thank you for, thank you for staying up late with me. How about that? But anyway, thank you for being here. I appreciate you being here again. Excellent chapter by Eustace Mullins. This was in 1989, folks. This is over 30 years ago. Over 30 years ago. And it hasn't gotten any better. It's gotten worse in this country, far worse. Because the criminals are in charge. All of them. So thank you for your having eyes to hear, eyes to see and ears to hear. And wish you a good night as I'm saying good night to you guys. You take care and have a good night.